Welcome. The following presentation was recorded at the annual Best Practices for Pollinators Summit, hosted by Pollinator Friendly Alliance and the Xerces Society. Please consider participating in the annual summit next year. You can find more about the summit at pollinatorfriendly.org/summit.
Farmer. I've had some animals, but I think actual farmers would have a lot better information on how to actually work with the animals. So I'm kind of the in between, like how to apply all this disturbance theory in our restoration work, and then how to start thinking about how to incorporate the animals. So yeah, grazing habitat in practice. My subtitle is "We Can't All Have Buffalo." Because I know there's probably a lot of you out there thinking, all right, we need to start incorporating animals. I'm going to get some buffalo. And that may or may not be practical for all of us. I'm hoping to have some buffalo someday, but it's going to be some time probably. So just a little bit more background. This is like a lot of what I do, a lot of urban and residential design and plantings, especially in the summers. This is what I do. Used to do like a lot of standard landscaping, retaining walls and stuff like that, patios. I usually try to convince people out of $20,000 retaining walls now and tell them just to spend a couple $100 on some seed and some prep and turn it all into native prairie. And it's going to function much better than a block retaining wall anyway. So a lot of this kind of stuff, I've gotten into a lot more larger scaled stuff. Prairie installations, meadow plantings, a lot of bluff remnant restoration work to do in my area. Yeah, prescribed burns, that sort of thing. So yeah, a lot of times what we're targeting and what I would traditionally target is highly showy plantings. So a lot of wildflowers, a lot of color, relay plantings, really beneficial for pollinators. But the question I've been learning to ask myself now is this actually a prairie? We call this a prairie planting, but is it actually a prairie, or is this more of a garden? What this is missing is some of those keystone functions, like the grazing. Sometimes we can incorporate the fire, but there's not really much for grasses in this planting in the photo here. So is this functionally a prairie? Maybe not. So how do we start thinking about the value of even asking that question? We've got a lot of goals in our plantings. We could be targeting different things with our planting. Some people are really into birds. Some people are really into invertebrates and pollinators, sometimes specialty pollinators. This is a rusty patch queen that I had in my yard. I've had them for years now. You can focus on herps even. We've got 6-line race runners on our bluffs. So there's lots of different things we can target. And so where should we kind of prioritize our energy? And I think we should be trying to prioritize as much of those targets as we can. But really we need to be kind of mixing it up, and maybe don't do the same thing your neighbor's doing. Or if you have a larger property, kind of mix up your practices on your own property. So our goals and our targets, as we're talking about maintaining heterogeneity and providing resources for different species, we need to address this issue of scale. So how we're going to approach a project in an urban residential setting, and how we're going to approach a kind of more wild managed savanna remnant, those are two entirely different things. They're going to require different practices from us and different management strategies. So I'll kind of start on the small side of things and kind of scale up from there. Our urban and residential plantings are typically plug plantings. They're going to require more intensive management. We're probably going to need to do hand weeding, kind of cut, maybe treat woody species that are moving in. Most of the times right up against our houses, we're not going to be implementing fire or grazing animals. That said, we can still try to maintain as much ecosystem function as possible. We can still plant densely and try to create competitive exclusion, so there's not really room for weeds to move in. At the same time, people like Heather Holm have talked about the importance of having bare patches for nesting bees and other species. Sometimes birds will take dust baths in bare patches, so we can still incorporate some of those practices. A lot of people are talking about trimming stems to prepare nesting cavities for bees and other insects, which is actually a way to mimic grazing, even in our urban and residential plantings. And then there's also, we may or may not need to be managing for some of those other disturbance causing creatures, such as deer, rabbits, moles. I was noticing just the other day that some shrubs around my house have been browsed by rabbits this winter. And so I was kind of frustrated with that, because some of those shrubs I like to keep around the house. But then as I walked 100 feet out from my house into my restored savanna, I was noticing what the rabbits were doing to all the blackberry brambles that were sprouting up. That's a species that I'm kind of trying to manage against and try to limit those from taking over. And so out there, the rabbits are actually doing me a favor. Yeah, so some of those urban and residential spaces may offer some unique benefits. You can really target some specific species. Some of them may have some unique constraints, though. This is just one example. I put a vegetative roof on my house when we remodeled it a few years ago. And so this has got 3 to 4 inches of engineered soil. So it's naturally dry and well draining, which favors a lot of kind of dry prairie species. And being up on a roof, I can also plant species that normally the deer and the rabbits would kind of mow down, and those species would have a hard time thriving. So this offers some unique possibilities up on this site, but I'm not going to probably have, a lot of people think I should have goats on this roof, and I don't think I'm going to have goats, but I probably will do some periodic biomass removals just with a string trimmer and a rake. I do have a water hookup up there and may actually try to do some patch burns on my roof at some point. I haven't quite decided on that yet. If I do, I will take photos and video of that. So yeah, how do we incorporate disturbance regimes into our plantings, even if they're kind of small? Just something to be thinking about. As we're scaling up, larger meadow plantings, larger backyards, they offer increasing flexibility for management options. They also require us to rely more on the keystone functions of the ecosystem. So we may be able to start incorporating some fire. We might be able to start getting some animals on the site. Usually in kind of urban, suburban areas, we don't necessarily have those options. There are some other grazing mimicking disturbances we can incorporate. This is something I do in my own yard, where I haven't been able to incorporate animals real close in by the house. Mowing off, not just mowing, but biomass harvesting off vegetation periodically. I don't do this on the whole site. I just do this on patches. Again, we're trying to create heterogeneity. Another thing we're doing is trying to mine off some of that excess nitrogen. I know Stephen touched on that. The figures that are coming out of Iowa right now, the researchers saying we've got about 10 to 20 pounds per acre per year just of atmospherically deposited nitrogen landing on our ecosystems, and mostly from fossil fuel combustion and ammonia applied to farmland. So any of those cycling processes we can start reactivating are going to kind of benefit us in the long run here. So a lot of times what I'll be doing is I'll coordinate with other management objectives. I've got patches in my plantings where I've got what I would say is kind of a little too much Canada goldenrod, which is a sign of higher levels of nitrogen. It's a nitrogen loving species. So I'm kind of trying to create heterogeneity in my yard by mowing off some portions of that land at a time. And then I'll oftentimes actually use all that biomass material as a blanket mulch on my vegetable garden. So I'm mining off nitrogen and putting it on my vegetable garden, which also means I don't have to do as much weeding. So that's like green compost that I'm putting on my vegetable garden. So in lieu of grazing animals, I'm just doing that management myself, kind of at a small scale. Some other benefits of that, some of you have probably noticed that your monarchs are going to lay eggs on new regrowth of milkweeds. They're going to prefer that. It's young, tender, succulent growth for those caterpillars to eat. You can also extend bloom periods of certain species by doing this. The section I mowed off there on the bottom left, I had goldenrod and asters blooming well after those species in the neighboring section there that wasn't mowed, well after those species were long done blooming. Top left, I've got echinacea blooming along with the New England asters. So a little more longevity in nectaring sources for pollinators maybe, but just in general, heterogeneity on the entire site. As we're scaling up, we're going to become more dependent on probably larger equipment to help us maintain or at least install or start up some of these larger plantings. But these larger sites are going to offer increasing flexibility and less dependence on intensive management. But again, increased dependence on relying on those keystone functions. So that's going to be grazing. And different animals obviously have different benefits in their grazing habits. Some like to graze low, some like to graze high first, some like to graze or browse rather broadleaf species, forbs, wildflowers, woody species, and some prefer the grasses. So it's not about what species you're using, it's about using them to their benefit. And it may be that we need to incorporate multiple species. Fire, again, yeah, there's some concerns about fire, but fire is just is a really slick way to maintain larger sites, just so it doesn't require so much intensive management. So woody species are constantly trying to take over a site, especially with our higher nutrient levels these days. And fire can help control that. It may not eradicate it completely, but that may not even be our goal in the first place. If we are maintaining the functionality of a site, that's really our long-term goal here. Just to talk about savanna again in general here, I kind of view prairie as part of savanna. And it's a matter of perspective again. I think Steve would agree that if you zoom out far enough, Earth looks a lot like a savanna ecosystem. You've got patches of wooded, forested areas, and you've got large patches of grassland or early succession, and then everywhere in between. So we want to keep that heterogeneity. But then again, this needs to be kind of our target as we're scaling up here. And this is what's going to offer a lot of management variability and the ability for us to incorporate fire and grazing again. So what is not savanna? First of all, on the top left there, you'll see a former savanna where you've got a big bur oak that's mostly dead. That one low horizontal limb, about, I would say maybe a third of that limb, it's damaged, but a third of that limb is actually still alive. But this tree is probably not going to last a whole lot longer. This is a site that we were recently clearing and trying to turn back into savanna, true savanna, functional savanna again. But we have a lot of this down in southeast Minnesota where I live, just a lot of what we would call afforested savanna and grassland, where it's mostly turning into a buckthorn invasive dominant ecosystem. And again, that nitrogen levels, all that nitrogen that's accumulating in our ecosystems is causing this kind of rampant weedy growth of woody vegetation, even if that is oaks and typically beneficial species. These bottom photos were from my back savanna restoration that I'm constantly working on. You can see these long bendy oaks that are just trying to find light, and then all these like thin wispy growth of all these other species. And this is clearly a former grassland, and we need to get it back to that because this is in a catastrophic ecosystem state. This is not a functional ecosystem anymore. So a lot of what I do is taking kind of that top left photo there, a degraded grassland, a degraded savanna, and trying to shift it back into a burnable, grazable ecosystem again. And that requires a lot of labor. It's very intensive. Oftentimes it's very expensive, but we need to get things back into that functional state again. I know Heather's been doing a lot of similar work and talked about this in her presentation as well. A lot of times that's going to mean some heavy equipment. I'm doing a lot of collaborating with other contractors that have that heavy equipment, whether it's feller bunchers Sometimes that's followed up by bulldozers and other excavators to pile and burn and clear biomass material from sites, forestry mulchers. I know this looks very heavy-handed. Like bottom left there is just looks kind of like a war zone. It's surprising that this actually turns into something green and lush right after this, but there's just a lot of biomass to remove. You can even do that on a smaller scale. I put my dad to work. He's retired, but he sells firewood kind of as his exercise routine and hobby, just to bring in a little cash. And I put him to work in my savanna, kind of continuing to thin things out and improve things, improve that keystone function again. If you think about it, this is probably over 100 years of biomass accumulation that we're trying to offset. So hundreds of years of mismanagement that we're trying to correct. Sometimes we can do a lot of this in even like a couple days or a week with this large equipment. May look very heavy-handed, but I'll show you what it looks like here in a minute. Yeah, here's some photos of the spring following one of these heavy-handed approaches, where the vegetation just bounced back with a vengeance. And there's stuff to control and continue to treat. Some of those stumps are going to resprout. We need to kind of contain those, oftentimes using herbicides, sometimes just mowing will work. But we have a lot of, the top right photo is a sedge meadow that just bounced back. It was underneath a pretty much complete canopy of dying ash trees and rows of planted soft maples. And once we removed those trees and got sunlight back down to the ground, the sedge meadow and even a lot of wildflower species started to bounce back immediately. Even some species that I hadn't seen before. This is a species of primrose on the bottom left that I hadn't seen anywhere else. But once we started clearing and opening up this site, stuff just kind of bounced back on its own. And sometimes you can get back to a functional state just by burning or mowing or grazing or a combination of those. But sometimes we need to revegetate the site. A lot of times those grasses are kind of the first thing to go when shade kind of overtops the whole site. So we need to restore that vegetation. And oftentimes that means we will, in our work, we will actually just install the grasses first, because we're prioritizing just getting that keystone function again, getting things back to a burnable, grazable state. We will eventually add the forbs and the wildflowers back in, usually about a year after we've started doing the restoration and the management on a site. But we just want to get those grasses back in there. We're going to be mowing and managing that site until those grasses are in. Once we can get it to a burnable state, then our management becomes much more easy. So in your plantings, don't skimp on the grasses. I know a lot of people like to plant really showy, flowery mixes that add a lot of color and be really great for pollinators, but that may not be good enough to get us to the highly functional state of a burnable, grazable ecosystem. Some species are probably even going to have to be hand planted from plugs or from bare root if you really want to incorporate some of those species back in that are harder to install just by spreading seed. So yeah, make sure you get your grasses in there. And there's tons of both cool season and warm season grasses and sedges and rushes for every different type of ecosystem. So we should just really be thinking about, how do we make this burnable? How do we make this grazable? And then obviously don't skip steps in your process. We want, if you're going to put seed out, you want to make sure that seed has the best opportunity to grow and establish. So that usually means at least a year of keeping the vegetation short by mowing it. Sometimes that even means handwork. And eventually you'll be able to start burning, and that's going to make the process much simpler. This is just an example of a site we're working on right now and kind of how we're trying to implement this in the valley that I live in. This is a bluff prairie we've been working on. Kind of the right section, there's a fence that goes straight up the bluff there. The right section is bluff prairie we restored 5 or 6 years ago, I think now. And then we've got this other landowner on board now. And so we're cutting and piling cedars and restoring the bluff prairie there. And then we're going to be doing a whole bunch of former savanna on top. There's all sorts of open grown oaks up there that we're going to kind of re-expose and reopen things up around. And we're probably going to need to reestablish the grasses because those are mostly gone from the ridgetop there. So it'll kind of go off to the right of the picture there. There's probably another 1.5 acres of savanna that we'll be doing. If you zoom out, you kind of go down the slope, we're actually connecting that bluff prairie restoration to larger savanna restoration, where we're using the feller buncher and some of this heavier equipment to kind of rebuild savanna down below. And then scaling out even farther, we're all the way down to kind of floodplain sedge meadows that we're restoring. This is all kind of on one property. And then kind of where you follow the stream to the right there, that's an adjacent property where we're going to be clearing and restoring this summer. And then you go even farther to the right, kind of across that lane below this development here. We've got more property owners on board, 2 more properties there. And then that is going to actually connect to that strip of farmland that you see that goes back towards the bluffs. And we're going to be starting to incorporate native vegetation in there as we restore that, and then incorporating grazing animals into that area. So this is just kind of an aerial view of how we're doing that, kind of prioritizing and implementing triage to save those bluff prairie remnants. The red ones are sites we've already done a lot of work on. And then there's also some smaller plantings. We got a Lawns to Legumes neighborhood grant the past couple of years, and we've been doing a lot of pollinator plantings. And I'm noticing now that there's a few plantings that I didn't actually include on the map here yet, so I'll need to add those. And then these are kind of how we're thinking bigger on a larger scale, implementing larger equipment. These are larger properties where we're doing bigger restorations and trying to kind of connect these sites. And then the long-term goal is to actually have kind of little farm hubs that are able to kind of service these restorations, these functional ecosystems again. So the bottom one is kind of a not very functional beef cattle farm right now that we're going to hopefully switch over to native vegetation and start making that a more functional farm again. On the top, owners are thinking about getting sheep. And so potentially we're going to have the ability to be grazing the sheep and the cattle kind of down through that stream corridor periodically, and kind of manage, and maybe even up onto the bluff prairies, and kind of managing these ecosystems kind of as a whole functional ecosystems again. So yeah, logistically, how do we make this work? We obviously need to make sure our friends and neighbors are on board, make sure the community isn't going to be upset with having livestock around. But most people are usually pretty willing to learn about doing this. And there's a lot of people that really want to see the region around them and their neighborhood thrive and have diversity improved and functionality improved. And it improves the aesthetics too. I mean, who wants to be looking out at a buckthorn thicket all the time and eroding soils? So there's some technologies coming on board that are really have a high potential for making this work, eat more easily at least. This is a product called a no fence collar. This is a solar charging GPS containment collar for livestock. They're making these for sheep and cattle and goats right now specifically. Think of it as an underground fence for your dog. It's a shock collar, but there's no actual underground wires. This is all GPS based. So we're going to be able to adjust grazing paddocks and pastures just on our phones. So animals are notified when they're approaching this virtual boundary with a tone. They get shocked if they go through that boundary. They get shocked for a certain range as they're going out, but if they turn back to avoid the shocks, they're then rewarded by no shock. So this is going to actually show us where all our animals are, show us if animals ever get out, which they get out of physical fences too. So this has a possibility of making a lot of fallow and abandoned land productive again, and much easier to maintain. Water is always an issue. It's just expensive unless you have access to a stream. Maybe someday we'll be able to have drones filling livestock watering troughs for us or something like that. Just stuff we need to figure out. And yeah, just because I know some of you that are stuck on the buffalo are already asking the question, We don't know if the collars will work on buffalo yet. Some of the buffalo owners that I know are pretty skeptical that they will, but we'll just have to wait and see. Obviously, as we're implementing livestock into our restorations, we're going to have to be adaptive. We're going to have to learn to just be good observers. We don't want to be implementing some prescriptive plan and be stuck on that. And then that's just going to hurt the ecosystem. We need to be able to observe what's happening to the ecosystem. Every site's going to vary, and we need to be able to be flexible with our management regimes. Again, this is something we just have to figure out. This is the diagram here is from Chris Helzer's blog, Prairie Ecologist, where they're experimenting with open gate rotational grazing down in Niobrara. They start all the animals out in paddock A. Eventually, when they start running out of feed, they open up the gate into B and then later into C. But animals are constantly returning back to that A paddock where the vegetation is constantly resprouting and is lush and is nutrient rich. And then section D is just left as refugia, is just left to grow and mature and flower and produce seed. So this is kind of one example of an approach that could be experimented with in integrating livestock. And some intensive areas of grazing are going to benefit some species. And some species are going to need more recovery time. So we just really need to learn to mix up our practices and observe and adapt and do different things on different parts of properties to build that heterogeneity. Fred Provenza's got a really good book out called Nourishment that talks a lot about how animals choose what they eat and benefit from what they eat. Obviously, they benefit from a diverse diet. Animals can actually self-medicate for illnesses and disease and parasites by choosing different plants. Purple prairie clover, for example, is a natural dewormer, a natural antiparasitic. So between good pasture management and rotation and incorporating some of these natural antiparasitics, we should be able to totally get away from using some of those chemicals in our livestock. Legumes, obviously, farmers are always looking to add legumes to their pastures. Plenty of beneficial native legumes, even oil producing crops that are being researched for commercial oil production to be found in some native forb species. Logistics with seed mixes. I get asked about toxic species. I think a lot of times we overthink that. I think that livestock has reactions with toxic species or problems with toxic species, mostly when a pasture is being overgrazed and that's all that's left. I think they know they don't want to eat it, but if that's all there is to eat, they're probably going to eat it. So obviously we want to avoid that. One thing that we can focus on is in our observation, just to kind of use as a tool, there are plenty of native species that we call them grazing increasers and grazing decreasers. So there's species that either increase with grazing and there's species that decrease with grazing. So there's species that we can just watch and we can kind of observe, okay, which species are benefiting right now and to what degree? And how do we shift our grazing practices to either target some of those species or to correct some of our grazing practices? These are some of those species here. So species that really benefit from having that grazing and that shorter vegetation and the less competition from tall species. And then there's the species that obviously the livestock really like. So they're going to eat as much of it as they can find. And we can use those observations to kind of balance our grazing practices. There's a lot of research being done on reincorporating native vegetation in our grazing practices. Obviously, historic megafauna did just fine on it and thrived on it. Couple points here I could talk about. Down south, native prairie hay is top dollar. It's highly sought after. It's highly nutritious. If you're doing haying, it's also like really high yield, and it's a warm season species. You're not trying to harvest it in the spring or really late into the fall. You have a shorter window in the summer to harvest it. So it just basically means you have less hay harvests, but you get more yield per harvest. And also, if you're trying to hay in the summer, it's a lot easier to get into a lot of sites that might be damp where you'd be likely to get your tractor stuck maybe. We should probably be grazing some of our floodplains, restoring some of our floodplains and grazing our floodplains. Even all that reed canary grass that is pretty much the single dominant species in our Mississippi floodplain by us, we probably should be grazing that. Native seed is obviously slower to establish and more expensive. And there's some other management considerations, but it's definitely workable. Good thing to always experiment. Stephen always brings up C.S. Halling, his quotes. He's got a quote basically that says, experiment wildly. And obviously with that, we need to be making observations, but we just need to be trying things and being adaptive in our work. This is a site, large bluff prairie remnant site, where we're experimenting with summer prescribed burning. We've been doing spring burns on portions of the site for many years now, but we're now trying to mix in some summer burns, which do have some different effects that we're trying to experiment with right now. On that site, we have state threatened Leonard skipper butterflies. So we're trying to kind of observe how our management strategies are affecting them. Yeah, again, with the livestock, heterogeneity is key. You're not going to have lush green vegetation everywhere. We need to learn to be okay with some bare patches of earth, some disturbed soil, and that's actually going to benefit some species, that heterogeneity. We don't want to have feedlot mud all over our entire property. But here, this is a snapping turtle that on a restored site now has access. It can now that all the buckthorn thicket is gone, it can now get up onto the shoreline to some of the mud holes close to where it's going to lay its eggs. We're going to need to learn to collaborate more, I think, with neighbors, friends, other organizations, farmers that may be near us, to try to figure out how to integrate kind of more agricultural approaches and restoration approaches together. Universities, we've been trying to coordinate with university classes. We've had them come out and help us do some restoration work, and now they're doing some research on streams and some of our restoration projects. I like to collaborate with other contractors, other restoration practitioners. And then, yeah, we also work a lot with the local chapter of the Prairie Enthusiasts, doing a lot of fire education and training. I think it's important that we have a more cultural approach to fire. I don't think the prescribed fire approach where we just bring in contractors all the time is going to be a long-term strategy. I think we need to get more people involved and more people more comfortable with fire management over time. And it goes with grazing too. We need to get more people comfortable with at least having animals on their land, even if they don't own them themselves. So I'm trying to do this kind of in my own neighborhood on a smaller scale regionally, but a larger scale compared to just my own property. So this is a group of friends, neighbors, that we're actually trying to implement this kind of valley-wide with on about a 6-mile stretch of valley just outside Winona. We're actually starting a nonprofit organization to try to do this better and try to get more traction for this idea. Because I wouldn't be starting another organization because there's already so many organizations out there doing different things, but there's nobody that's really doing this specifically. So just really briefly, this is our name. It's about animals consuming restored vegetation. And then up the food chain, we do as well as the carnivores. We are what we eat eats. Our cute little logo derived from that figure 8 that Stephen was talking about, the adaptive cycle. Our mission, advancing restorative land use practices that reintegrate communities with native ecology. Again, that sounds a lot like a lot of regenerative agricultural groups, but we are really focusing on integrating the native ecology. Kind of stuff we see ourselves doing, both here as we develop our own proof of concept in our valley, and then kind of scaling out and helping other people do this regionally. This is just what it looks like, kind of our vision for our valley, our proof of concept. Our bluff prairie remnants are where we start, kind of save those remaining reservoirs of biodiversity, native grasses, wildflowers, invertebrates. Projects are already being done. People that we think we're going to have a lot of leverage with that are wanting to collaborate with us. other people that are like single landowners that have, say, 1,300 acres that are already wanting to incorporate this. City spaces that we can leverage development rights with in exchange for restoration work and livestock permissions. And then in the end, farm hubs that are going to be servicing those restorations and making these ecosystems truly functional. Last couple slides. So yeah, our basic question is, how do we balance our food and material needs with a thriving biodiverse native ecology? And that obviously requires a whole ecosystem approach. So yeah, we're not managing for specific food products or certain resources. We're managing for the ecosystem that's producing that. So it's a truly functional approach. So yeah, we're just getting that organization rolling. So feel free to connect with us. But it's just starting out now. So be patient as we kind of grow it.
Yeah,
that's all I got.
Well, we're going to bring Steve back. Steve, can you unmute yourself? And I'm going to throw these questions out at both of you. Feel free to grab either one of you. So the first one's from Cameron, and it's about climate change. So with the shift, and specifically referring to northern climates and the ecology of the Boundary Waters area, but in general, what's happening with savannas and grasslands? How is that? What's the shift that you're seeing?
I know that the current narrative right now is that the forest will change to grasslands, and from my perspective, that we see the exact opposite happening. I think Gabe would say that too. We see grasslands just rapidly transitioning into woodlands. I can't use the word forest there. And I think too, when I'm up in Ely, Minnesota, on the edge of the Boundary Waters, and severe rain comes and washes out, and then the next day I find a tooth of a giant bison sitting there. It's these systems have been changing back and forth, and Gabe went over it really well. What is a savanna, what is a forest, and I think sometimes we want to hold it in one direction. It's like, this is a forest, and when that fire came through that forest out in Glacier National Park, and that like 96-year-old park ranger said to me, I guess it depends if it's a prairie or a forest. So when you look at it, and as long as Gabe and Heather Holmes hit on this yesterday, as long as the ecosystem is functional, and the greatest model that we have for functional ecosystems are our historic native vegetation. And so I think the best thing we can do is adapt ourselves at figure 8 and shift if the climate does shift this way. And Gabe and I, we're for, when we do multiple seed rains, we're usually mixing genotypes up. We're staying within the proximity, 200 miles, maybe we go out a little bit further, but we're bringing in those southern genotypes to mix with some of the northern genotypes, and then we sit back and see what happens. I guess it's the best thing, patience. But
yeah, I see.
Yep.
I see the same thing. I would say though also that like the capacity for restored grasslands and savanna might be increasing a little bit as the temperature rises. But we're working against a lot. Like the nitrogen issue is under recognized, I think, too. So we're dealing with a lot. And obviously the connectivity, the ability for invertebrates and pollinators to transfer north as things warm is really limited right now too.
Just a caveat on that. We call warm season grasses warm seasons, but their preference is extremely low CO2 levels. They're actually emerged during the ice ages. So that's something else that's really interesting to think about, is that our 4C grasses are actually ice age origin, super low CO2 levels. But yeah, and I see those models. I have the newspaper, the whole state of Minnesota, how the Boundary Waters will change into a grassland. We see the exact opposite happening. So it's really interesting.
Okay, so this next question is shifting gears a little bit more on grazing, and I'd like to invite Carl to turn his audio on and turn his video on. and join in the conversation if you're up for it. So this question is about cattle and other ungulates that, you know, are grazing on pasture, and when doing restorations that have animals on them, what about introducing some of these native species that we're putting in prairies might be poisonous to grazers? So what are your thoughts on that? And Carl, are you with us here?
Yes, I am. You can hear me, but the host stopped the video. There we go.
There we go.
There I am. I don't think that we're going to have a lot of issues with, I don't know, on the toxicities, and that'd be a good, question for Gabe and Stephen on the native grasses. It would be great to have introductions. What I'm going to be talking about when in my presentation coming up here will be on more perennial pastures, not permanent pastures, in rotations with cropland. And trying to get some of the natives introduced into that is a little trickier, but it would be great to get them introduced into it.
I think we tend to overthink the toxic question quite a bit. I think a lot of Provenza talks a lot about this a ton in his book Nourishment, about how kind of the matriarchs of a herd will be teaching their young what to graze and what not, and when to graze it and how hard to graze it. And so, I mean, there's a lot of considerations. I mean, if you're moving a herd from the Southwest up to Minnesota, and they're not going to understand the vegetation up there, so they may be experimenting a lot more. But I think in general, given enough time in a region and enough experience with the vegetation there, I think the animals are just going to figure things out on their own.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah,
I even go ahead.
Oh, I was going to add something else. We are taught in botany. I've been taught in botany that plants will evolve toxins or thorns to thwart grazing animals. I mean, that is the classic botany teaching. And if we look at, again, the paleoecology record, over time, our plants have ramped up edibility. And I threw that slide out today. I usually show that slide, but the rose family, the fagales, the walnuts, the grasses became increasingly more edible, like the canvasback, the wild celery. And so from a different perspective, as the plants became more edible, they could feed more herbivores and regulate the nutrients to the whole entire ecosystem. So it's kind of a hangover too, like Gabe was saying, where we overemphasize the toxicity. I think that 90% from what going over the USDA plant database will list, bloat, CN ratio, digestibility, platability for grazing animals, forage potentials, every single plant. And I would say easily 90, if not 95% of the plants native plants are excellent for herbivores. Yeah. Yep.
Can you list or give us a few of your favorite forbs for grazers that work for grazers?
Yeah, Gabe talked about the legumes, Lespedisia, the bush clover, any of your grasses, your C4, your cool season grasses are extremely edible. And I think we had a lot more cool season grasses here in North America. We're very C4 oriented, but we had poas, we had agrostis, we had fescues right here in Minnesota, everywhere. It's a mistake not to think. So I know Gabe, I saw his seed mixes and my mixes too were extremely diverse. Gabe and Karen Jokala of the Xerces Society actually designed a mix that actually purposely put in some distasteful plants for herbivores like Euro, just so the pollinators had a resource. And I was like, wow, that's really cool. I never thought about that before. But so it's almost harder to put plants into our seed mixes that would be non-edible. Asters are a great example, which is the sunflower family are very highly edible. And again, like Gabe was saying, sometimes when they know they're going to bloom, like, okay, put some toxicity in our leaves right now because we're finally going to do seeds. But in the long run, they want to be eaten. Look at our shrubs, Carl, dogwood, the service berries, the hawthorns, the plums are super edible. And if you eat a plum tree, browse it, then it grows two flowers and two fruits, more nectar, more pollen. So you see, all these plants are really designed like that. And then Gabe and I are working also on a program that we'd like to bring to the NRCS for funding. And I think this can go region wide, where we would actually help you and pay farmers to put land set aside to put a certain potential amount of land into natives. And once it's established, like say 3 to 5 years, then we could graze it or hay it. Or you could go into public lands, like Gabe's talking about the floodplain forest down there. Once we clear it out and get it settled, it's a public land, but maybe you could graze it too. So we're looking at how we can make it workable for you guys too, you know, the grazers out there.
The other thing I think, Stephen, it'd be helpful if you brought up too is talking about toxicity with some of the pasture grasses and stuff. And Carl, you've probably observed this at times too, but Stephen, do you want to talk about the nitrates in orchard grass? And
yeah. So one of the favorite grasses that a lot of grazers really love is orchard grass. And I know restoration ecologists that have been planting it, like in savanna restorations, like, well, it's shade tolerant, and the grazers love it. And so I was in an organic pasture in Minnesota on a pasture walk recently, and in the low area, you know, and the guy's been organic since the 1990s, and he's a really good grazer. And in the low area where the nitrogen always flows, he had thistles and burdock and nettles, and you know, he's organic. So he's like, God, I hate these weeds down here, and I know it's low, and so I understand why it's there. But there's orchard grass growing right next to it. The preferred grazing plant hasn't been touched. And he just had the cattle in there the other day. I'm like, oh my God, they're not touching the preferred grass. And they were just in here yesterday. Went home, Google Scholar, and I found a paper from 1962. A guy said that orchard grass is definitely nitrophilic. I kind of predicted that. It can absorb so much nitrogen that it can kill full-grown cattle. So it was like, right. So even these plants are highly edible outside of a high nitrogen zone. You put them in nitrogen, now they're going to kill your cattle. So Gabe was talking about nitrogen. Isn't that interesting, right? We're destroying our planet with our nitrogen. It's really crazy.
And lack of diversity, you know, in a situation like that where he's just got orchard grass, and if it's in a low bottom, it's actually not at home. It really doesn't work like it should when it's in wet ground with that heavy, massive root system. It clumps up, becomes unpalatable, like you said, is picking up extra nitrogen. So diversity is what, you know, that's one of the things that I promote heavily is let's get as much diversity out there. And you look at the toxicity that we were talking about earlier. If it's only 1 or 2 plants out there, they're, you know, like you said, they're probably not going to eat it. And then introducing new species, it's, to me, it's kind of funny and amazing. Excuse me. It's kind of amazing that you turn cattle into a species that they've never eaten before, like let's say Sudan grass. It might take them 3 days to start eating it because they're going to nibble it first and see if it hurts them. Then they'll eat a little bit more, and then after that, they go to town on it.